Modern Star Trek fixes a problem that killed the franchise 20 years ago. Although Star Trek is still recognizably one of the biggest sci-fi franchises in the world, there was a time when the saga was thrust into redundancy for over a decade before it was brought back and reworked for the modern era. Although there have been many Star Trek movies over the decades, it's the Star Trek TV shows that create the heart of the space opera's sprawling, generational narrative. So, because the franchise has such a storied history, it has understandably gone through many changes since its inception. Star Trek can generally be split into two eras, the classic shows and the modern ones. After Star Trek, the original series cast began, the story began in 1966. The franchise enjoyed an impressive spell of largely uninterrupted storytelling spanning many movies and TV shows. Unfortunately, Star Trek Enterprise's Season 4 finale was the last fans would see from the Star Trek TV shows for a long while when the original series prequel came to an end in 2005. Thankfully, Star Trek has now learned from the lesson that caused its long hiatus. Many of the classic Star Trek shows were too similar. Star Trek, the original series, was groundbreaking in its time, and Star Trek, The Next Generation, refined the formula even further as the show's first live-action spin-off. However, after that, the next three shows started to become less and less distinct from the tweaked blueprint laid out by The Next Generation. Of course, there were differences, but few that were particularly notable when it came to separating most of the classic-era Star Trek TV shows. This resulted in a feeling of sameness and fatigue that led to the franchise as a whole becoming redundant by 2005 Star Trek Enterprise finale. There is an argument to be made for Star Trek Deep Space Nine being a standout among these projects, as it introduced non-Starfleet personnel as part of the main cast and engaged in semi-serialized storytelling. Regardless, when held up against its other contemporaries like Star Trek, Voyager, Deep Space Nine's overall aesthetic and feel still wasn't all that unique. Even delving deep into the timelines past with Star Trek Enterprise wasn't quite enough to create a show that came across as a brand new experience, and it remained that way until Star Trek Discovery premiered in 2017. Star Trek Discovery kickstarted the modern era of the Prime Universe after J.J. Abrams' Kelvin timeline movies. Discovery's drastic differences when compared to the franchise classic era made many fans believe the show was also set in the Kelvin timeline, but this was not the case. All 5 seasons of Star Trek Discovery are strongly serialized, which was an approach that the advent of streaming services allowed the project to embrace while moving away from its predecessor's episodic format. It also made the divisive decision to have a main character rather than revolve around a traditional ensemble cast. Star Trek Picard followed in Discovery's footsteps by serializing its narrative and also largely focused on Patrick Stewart's title character. Although the dark and gritty tones of both shows made them similar, Picard differed by being a legacy sequel to Star Trek The Next Generation. As more new shows were announced, their formats continued to be vastly different. Star Trek Voyager also received a disguised legacy sequel, only in animated form in the shape of Star Trek Prodigy. Perhaps most surprising has been the immense success of a Star Trek animated comedy, with Lower Decks' brilliance catching everyone off guard. In the vast universe of science fiction, few franchises have endured as long or as turbulently as Star Trek. From its bold 1960s origins to the cinematic highs and lows of the late 20th century, the franchise has seen more resurrections than most starship captains see warp jumps. But what many fans forget, or perhaps try to ignore, is that Star Trek nearly imploded 2 decades ago. By the early 2000s, Trek was in creative freefall. Overexposure, stale storytelling, and a disconnect from its core audience left it gasping for warp speed. Yet today, it's not just back, it's thriving. So what changed? Modern Star Trek fixed a problem that had once threatened to destroy it: the loss of emotional and thematic relevance. To understand the fix, we have to go back to the collapse. After The Next Generation ended, Deep Space Nine and Voyager followed with mixed success. Then came Enterprise, a prequel series that, despite a promising cast and a fresh setting, never quite took off. The problem wasn't that these shows lacked ideas, it was that they recycled too many of them. The formula was predictable: a weekly alien of the week, technobabble solutions to moral quandaries, and characters that too often felt like walking uniforms instead of real people. Star Trek, which had once boldly gone where no show had gone before, had become formulaic. And worse, it had stopped evolving with its audience. Fast forward to the 2020s, and modern Star Trek is a different beast. Shows like Discovery, Picard, Strange New Worlds, and Lower Decks have re-energized the franchise. They've done so not by abandoning the spirit of Trek, but by reconnecting with what made it vital in the first place: relevance, risk, and heart. One of the biggest problems of the early 2000s era was emotional detachment. The characters often felt like templates, competent but distant. Today's Trek flips that. Modern Trek understands that fans want more than phaser fights and spatial anomalies. They want stories about people, flawed, struggling, resilient people grappling with complex, personal issues. Burnham in Discovery is emotionally raw, shaped by trauma, and constantly wrestling with identity. Picard explores aging, regret, and redemption. Strange New Worlds brings back episodic storytelling, but with characters who evolve and emote in ways we rarely saw in earlier decades. This shift reflects a broader change in TV storytelling. Audiences now expect serialized arcs, emotional authenticity, and moral nuance. Trek had to adapt or die, and it did. The emotional range has expanded. There's more crying, more laughing, more doubt. Some older fans bristled at this at first, calling it too touchy-feely, but in truth, it's a return to what Star Trek always aimed for, showing the human condition through a sci-fi lens. Another critical fix? Diversity, not just in casting, but in perspectives. Early Trek was groundbreaking for its time, but modern Trek doubles down. It showcases LGBTQ+ characters, mental health struggles, neurodiversity, and racial dynamics in a way that's baked into the narrative, not just window dressing. It doesn't always get it right, but it's trying, and in doing so, it's inviting new generations to see themselves in the stars. Even visually and tonally, the franchise has evolved. The cinematic quality of today's shows rivals feature films. The effects are stunning, the stakes feel real, and the tone shifts depending on the show. Lower Decks brings humor and satire, Strange New Worlds captures that classic optimism, while Discovery leans into high drama and emotional arcs. There's a Trek for every kind of fan now, and that flexibility is key. So what exactly was the problem that killed the franchise 20 years ago? Complacency. Star Trek stopped asking hard questions. It stopped evolving. It leaned too heavily on nostalgia without updating its soul. But modern Trek has learned from that collapse. It's taken risks, embraced discomfort, and in doing so rekindled its core mission, to explore not just space, but ourselves. In the end, Star Trek didn't survive because it played it safe. It survived because it remembered that its greatest frontier is the human experience. And as long as it keeps reaching for that, with empathy, courage, and curiosity, Star Trek will live long and prosper. Stunning, the stakes feel real, and the tone shifts depending on the show. Lower Decks brings humor and satire, Strange New Worlds captures that classic optimism, while Discovery leans into high drama and emotional arcs. There's a Trek for every kind of fan now, and that flexibility is key. So what exactly was the problem that killed the franchise 20 years ago? Complacency. Star Trek stopped asking hard questions. It stopped evolving. It leaned too heavily on nostalgia without updating its soul. But modern Trek has learned from that collapse. It's taken risks, embraced discomfort, and in doing so rekindled its core mission, to explore not just space, but ourselves. In the end, Star Trek didn't survive because it played it safe. It survived because it remembered that its greatest frontier is the